Good evening. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. My name is Bill Kelly. I'm the former Mellon Director of the Research Libraries. It's a pleasure to be with you in this remarkable space, talking about Melville and the Bartos Forum. It doesn't get any better than that. I feel very blessed this evening. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's celebration of the Met's new production of Moby-Dick. Performances, as you will, I'm sure, know, begin on March 3rd and run through March 29th. We are fortunate indeed to have the composer Jake Heggie and the librettist Gene Scheer with us this evening. They will speak about their work and introduce members of the company who will perform passages from the production, a very exciting thing to anticipate. Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Jennifer Egan, a great friend of this library, will join the conversation. Ms. Egan is a former fellow of the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the library, where she worked on her remarkable novel, Manhattan Beach, a book which draws inspiration from Moby-Dick. You can find their bios in the printed program. Melville's readers have long recognized the alignment of Moby-Dick's form and interests with opera. Its polyvocalities, its crossing of genre boundaries, its oceanic ambitions. The novel is an omnibus of subjects and contexts, and like opera, it requires the collaboration of an audience to realize its intentions. In a letter to Nathaniel Hawthorne thanking him for, quote, having understood the book, Melville wrote that truth is ever incoherent. That's coming from Melville himself. Only when its windings are traversed in concert with another, when big hearts strike together, in Melville's phrasing, does meaning, however contingent, take shape. Such encounters stand at the heart of operatic performance, a consonance of feeling among composer, librettists, musicians, and audience that touches what Melville described as, quote, the profoundest sense of being. That coherence is hard won and always transient. Again, from the good book, Melville writes, for small erections may be finished by their first architects. Grand ones, true ones, ever leave the copstone for posterity. God keep me from ever completing anything. This whole book is a draft, nay, but the draft of a draft. Oh, time, strength, cash, and patience. It's a paragraph that has been printed and put on most graduate students' desks. Heggie and Scheer have embraced the role Melville assigns posterity, the pursuit of the ungraspable phantom of life, the dialectical refinement of received meaning. Like him, they understand, again quoting Melville, Leviathan is not the biggest fish. I have heard of krakens. We are the beneficiary of their deep diving, the fiery hunt they reimagine and bring to life, and we are grateful to them for sharing that journey with us this evening. For those of you inclined to know more about Melville's drafts, do note that NYPL holds one of the most important repositories of literary manuscripts and correspondence by and about Melville and his world. That rich archive is freely available to you at this greatest of public libraries, an institution that takes the importance of public quite seriously. Finally, a bit of housekeeping. At the end of the evening, Jake, Gene, and Jenny will be glad to take some of your questions. Please write them on the note cards which library staff members have circulated and will collect. If you're watching online, please put your questions in the chat. Now, please join me, if you will, in welcoming Jake Heggie, Gene Scheer, Jennifer Egan, and the Director of Live from NYPL, Aidan Flax-Clark.
Hi, everybody. I've brought some totemic books, but I'm just going to put them here at my feet. I'm not going to read them to you, don't worry. How's everybody doing? As I said the other day, it's sort of a season for mild enthusiasm, so we'll allow it this night, but normally we require more enthusiasm. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
What a pleasure to join you. Amazing. Amazing. I can't see you, but I know you're there.
You look good. We know you look good. Should we get right into it?
All right. Please.
So this is Jake, Gene, and Jenny. And yeah, give it up for them. I'm Aiden. And we're going to talk a lot about this amazing show, which opens next week on March 3rd, runs through March 29th, and you can still get tickets at metopera.org. I'm sure they're going fast, so right after this, please get them. Before that, though, can I ask you each about your relationship with the novel Moby-Dick, when you first read it, and how it sort of figures in your reading life and your creative life? And since you're next to me, I'm going to put you on the spot, Jenny, and ask you first.
Well, I first encountered the novel in high school, and I loathed it. I mean, I think it maybe is too early to read Moby-Dick, especially in a sort of, indifferent, overcrowded public school classroom. It just didn't work for me at all. But then I returned to it when I began getting very interested in maritime New York as part of research for my novel Manhattan Beach. And it was a sublime experience that time. And I both read it and listened to it. And I really recommend that for audiobook lovers. Oh my God, the language it really lends itself as we're going to hear in this opera. So those are my experiences, much better the second time around.
My old boss, Lewis Lapham, used to swear to me that he read it when he was 8 years old. And I was like, no, you didn't.
My experience is similar. I read it in high school and also skipped so many of the chapters, many of which have become some of my favorites, actually, all the stuff with cetology and all. And my relationship with the book really started with this project. Jake approached me with it. This was Terrence McNally's idea initially to do this. And he asked if I would do it. And I said, let me read it, of course, which I did. And before I knew I would want to do it, but I had to do my due diligence. And I also had the feeling of this is an incredibly sublime work and something that I saw all sorts of possibilities, huge challenges to be sure, but great possibilities as when I read the book, the first of many, many times in preparation for doing the opera. But it's a book. It's fun now because it's been many years since we wrote this opera, and I'm rereading it now actually, and it's so much fun to come back to it and sort of revel in the incredible, the depth of it and the language of it, and it's been a great joy, and I expect it to be a great joy for the rest of my life.
And hello, I'm Jake. I too tried to read it when I was actually a freshman in college and living in Paris, France. And I don't remember why it came to me, but we were doing a lot of Shakespeare, and someone said, if you're enjoying the Shakespeare, read this. And I thought, that is a really long play. But and I was too young to really take it in. I was, chasing my heroes, Chopin, Debussy in Paris, and wasn't prepared. But when Terrence McNally came up to me, and we were talking about a next project, and he said, well, there's only one thing I want to do, and it's Moby-Dick. And I just kind of went, what? and he saw the look on my face, and I looked at him, and he had this twinkle in his eye and this smile, and I said, he knows it's possible. And if a great man of the theater like that knows it's possible, then it's possible. And then I dove into the book. I read it like 2-3 times and circled the language and the passages and the chapters that really moved me, all the marginalia I wrote in, because I could feel the music. You must sense that when you read it. It is so full of music. And I knew that there was an opera there. There was music there if we could get the libretto, down from 800 pages, and a little less Wagnerian, it would be possible. And so that was my relationship with the book. And then Terrence had to withdraw, and Gene graciously stepped in, and we went on a journey of discovery through that book, and we went to Nantucket, and we walked the streets, and we read all the other stuff. We met Nat Philbrick, the wonderful writer, and it was actually his book In the Heart of the Sea that suddenly humanized it in a way that the characters just became very real. And so it actually informed our work on Moby-Dick. So it's very connected.
So it's good. Jump in. One of the books that it was called The Trying Out of Moby-Dick by Howard Vincent from the late 40s. And it's a book about all of the sources. Makes me think of it because of Nat. All of the sources that Melville assembled in order to write Moby-Dick. It was really an inspiration to me to think about all the things that were on his table when he was writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of Old Testament, a little bit of John Milton. What else was on that list? Do you recall?
Scoresby. There was lots of stuff from a lot of passages about the whaling and cetology and such found their way in, edited down and so forth. And so there's lots of references to the history of whaling and such, which he I wouldn't say he cut and pasted, but he used, and sort of brilliantly, and it's a wonderful book.
So Jake, I was going to ask you what on earth possessed you to do this in the first place, but you beautifully answered that. But I wonder if you could expand more about the musicality of the book, because I think, like you said, everyone senses it, and I think there's various levels. But I wonder if you could talk in detail about what kind of music you heard when you were reading it and how that manifested.
It wasn't so much that I heard the music; I felt it. I felt it deeply, and I didn't know what it was, and I knew that I wouldn't know what it was until we had an architecture and a shape. Because, of course, you can't just put a book on a stage. You can't just put a book, I mean, you could try. It's going to be really dull, So we were going to have to change things. I had my first opera, Dead Man Walking, I had learned a lot about writing for the operatic stage, because Sister Helen Prejean is alive and well, and it's her book, but Terrence McNally brilliantly redid things, invented things, changed journeys and trajectories, because opera demands mythology, and it's not about exactly what someone said or exactly what someone did, but it's about how it felt and how that inspires music. So I can't say that I knew what the music was, I just knew it was there. And when Terrence withdrew, he left us with 3 ideas. One is that Ahab is a Helden tenor. His voice soars over everyone, Some people said to me, well, I mean, Ahab's so evil, shouldn't he be a bass? I'm like, is he evil? He's not evil. He's a tragic hero, And he knows he's losing control. Anyway, that was very, very helpful. Pip, the cabin boy, would be a soprano in a pants role, and the whole thing would take place at sea. And that also freed us up a lot. And then when Gene and I started to talk and come up with ideas, I don't remember when it was, but we thought, instead of the first line of the novel opening the opera and us listening to someone telling a story about what happened and they already survived, what if it was the last line of the opera? And we earn that journey, and we learn about this greenhorn sailor who, when he's rescued as the sole survivor, doesn't say what his name is. He says, "Call me Ishmael." And that also opened up, because then we could change things, we could move things around, because that's the person that's observing things who will then go on to write the book.
Yeah, I have to say that was, maybe the most famous opening line in all of literature. To move it and then choose to open with Queequeg was a very bold and fascinating choice. Can you talk a little bit more about how you landed on opening with Queequeg?
Well, there's in this novel, in novels, there's a narrator frequently. There's a narrator, and in an opera there isn't a narrator, and yet there is. The narrator is the composer. He or she is infusing it with that sort of omniscient voice that knows the story, that feels the story, and is telling it. And Jake, that's what Jake has done so beautifully in this opera. But in order to do that, we needed to shift things around. And so that the idea of having this young sailor, as I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, have read the book, and as you know that Ishmael is the only character who's never been on a whaler before. That he's been at sea, but he's never been on a whale ship before. And so to watch this person have all of these experiences that are depicted in the book and watch them happen in real time. So you're watching him experiencing all of these things rather than him narrating it and saying, I remember when this happened to me, and then this happened to me, and then this happened to me. We're watching it happen in real time. It's not theatrical. You want to see these things take place. And so when I was reading the book, it seemed to me that, there are all of these different characters who represent different ways of living one's life. There's Ahab with his obsessive inability to accept the world the way it is. There's the religious answer, which is Starbuck. There's Stubb, who's laughing his way through life, as many people do, and Flask, who is not particularly serious about his life. And then, of course, there's Queequeg, who becomes his great friend, who represents sort of the equipoise and that he is drawn to. I'll try a pagan friend, since Christian kindness has proved but hollow courtesy. So that the idea of, as Jake said, it was Terence's idea to put this all on the ship. So I had to find a way to have Greenhorn, this Ishmael character, thank you, sorry, but I got excited. This Ishmael character meet Queequeg, and I mined the Ramadan chapter, in which Queequeg is chanting. And in the book, Ishmael is saying, what's going on in there, what's going on in there? And in the opera, he's on the boat, he's chanting. This is the way the opera opens. And I found a Samoan chant that Jake has written. And Ishmael can't sleep. Greenhorn can't sleep because this guy's keeping him up. And that's how they meet. And but it's actually, it's pulled from the opening chapters of the book, and then structurally it's built around the Ramadan chapter.
So we're going to hear a performance in a second, and I'm going to ask you in a minute to tee that up, Jake. But Gene, before that, the performance that we're going to hear is a good example of how much of the novel verbatim that you used. I think I read it was sort of like 50 word for word.
50% or so. It's, I haven't counted the lines, but it's clearly, my attitude was, if it works, it's in. And if I can find the lines in the book, I'm going to use them. The language is so rich. One of the reasons we wanted to do this was to use Melville's language, because it's so incredibly rich.
And one of the hard parts is you're only cutting great material.
Right.
It's really hard.
So I don't know. There's some clunker chapters in there.
But we had to, but the trick was to try to not make it clear when I was writing it, or when I was mining from the book. But which Jake will describe, I believe, the excerpt you're about to hear, that is in large measure from the book, and other excerpts you'll hear tonight are in large measure from the book, doctored some, and not just edited, fiddled with in order to make the points we wanted to make dramatically. But one of the great things about this novel is how rich the language is, and how dramatic it is, and how I would say this: I think most of what, not all, but most of what Ahab sings is from the book. Most of in that character. With Starbuck, it's more of a 50-50 thing, and with Ishmael as well, it's more of a 50-50 deal. But with Ahab, there was such. I mean, that was one of the things we were circling when we were reading the book. It's just such an extraordinary language, and so dramatic, and so King Lear-like, it's just so you want to use that.
So we're going to hear, speaking of Ahab, a little bit from Ahab, and then a duet between Pip and Stubb. So Jake, can you set these performances
Let's
up
hear
for us?
A little bit from Ahab, shall we? He does not have his peg leg on tonight. That's a funny story. When Ben Heppner sang the premiere and we were playing it through for him, I played the whole score through for him, and he was very excited. And then he's a big guy. And I said, so which leg do you think you're going to want to have as the peg leg? And he went, peg leg?
It looks very uncomfortable. I watched rehearsal the other day. It's terrible.
But just to sing the role is so demanding, but then to do it on a set with this leg and this rigging, so it's just extraordinary feat.
and a tribute to the costumer, Jane, who's
and
just
to these singers. Oh my God.
Incredible.
So Alex is going to sing the scene, the aria, in the middle of Act One that actually, it was the seed that allowed me to find the whole world of the opera. I had been writing for 6 months, trying to write chronologically, and it just wasn't working. It wasn't working, and I write everything by hand on these big sheets, and I had to discard it all. I said, I still don't know who Ahab is. I don't know who he is. He's an archetype to me still. And I said, well, I have to go around this block, this wall. And I went to this scene, I leave a white and turbid wake. Beautiful monologue where Ahab is standing and he realizes he's losing touch with everything. He no longer finds joy in the things that used to bring him joy and gratification. He's looking at the beautiful sea and the sun is setting and it does nothing for him. And it was such a human moment. And the character suddenly was right there in front of me, and the music emerged, and the theme for him emerged, and the whole theme for the whole four-chord progression that the entire opera is structured around started to emerge. It was an amazing experience, and then I went back to the beginning of the opera and wrote the whole thing in 4 months. But it took me going to that place and finding Ahab before that was possible. So you're going to hear this aria called I Leave a White and Turbid Wake. Alex Boyer is going to sing it for you. And are we ready?
Well, I think we're going to hear both of them right in a row, so can we tell
right.
what will follow?
Okay. Okay. And so following that, because we need comic relief, don't we? We're going to have a duet between Stubb and Pip. So Pip is the cabin boy, of course, and it's a pants role played by Janai Brugger, wonderful soprano. And Malcolm MacKenzie is singing Stubb. And we wanted to acknowledge the chapters about sharks in the water and also the whale steak.
Right. I mean, this is a lot of this is drawn from the book. Tasting a whale steak, tough, rare, and bloody. The language is conflated and moved around, but it's mostly from the book and certainly from the spirit of the book, which is what we were trying to accomplish.
And so we wanted a fun moment between Stubb and Pip, and that's what the scene is. And Pip has his tambourine, not tonight, but when you watch it, you'll hear a tambourine. Anyway, so here's I Leave a White and Turbid Wake, and then the duet.
Stub, why stub? That's my title. Well, a stub, what of it, stub? I feel funny. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, skee-ra-lee-ra. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, skee-ra-lee-ra. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. High pip, low pip, see the sharks are circling.
I say,
3 months they've been wanting something tough and bloody.
tough and bloody.
No whale sticks for ye. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, skee-ra-lee-ra. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, skee-ra-lee-ra. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Sharks know how to eat a whale steak.
Whale steak.
Tear the flesh right off the bone. Tough, rare, and bloody.
Tough, rare, and bloody.
Rare and bloody. Aye. Aye. That's what I could use, a juicy whale steak. Just as the sharks like 'em.
Tough.
Tough, don't eat it tender.
Rare.
Rare, just barely warm it.
Tough.
Tough,
Rare.
rare, I can almost taste it. Tough, rare, and bloody, attaboy, pip.
Tough, rare, bloody, bloody.
I see, you see.
I see, you see.
Does it take much
Does it take much
study? I'll take a whale steak. Tough, rare, and bloody.
Rare and bloody.
Rare and bloody.
Rare and bloody.
Fa-la-la-la-la-la, skee-ra-lee-ra. Fa-la-la-la-la-la, skee-ra-lee-ra.
Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la-la.
I feel funny.
So that was, again, Alex Boyer as Ahab, Janai Brugger as Pip, and Malcolm MacKenzie as Stub, and accompaniment was by Katelan Trần Terrell. Let's give it up for them one more time. It's not bad. This is a great spot to be, I have to say.
It's for me too. It's a dream.
Jenny, there's something that really sticks out to me about those scenes that I wanted to ask you about, which is that they come in the book at a moment, or rather I should say, it's one of the moments in the book that it really reveals itself to be a shapeshifter, the novel. You know, all of a sudden there are stage directions, there are these monologues, there's even a scene that's written in dramatic dialogue, and it kind of represents, Andy Del Banco called the book restlessly experimental. I think Nathaniel Philbrick called it dangerously digressive. But, you know, obviously Melville was sort of way ahead of his time in terms of experimentation, and I think that you have experimented in your novels as well, I mean, in a different way with form, and I think especially about, like, Goon Squad and Candy House. And so, I mean, a couple questions. One is, you know, I think Melville's experimentation is something that either makes people love Moby-Dick or really detest it. So first off, I'm curious how you related to that aspect of the novel. Did you find that compelling or distasteful? Was that something you embraced, had to get over?
You know, I think the experimentation in it, to me, seems like a feature of Melville's obsession with everything having to do with whaling and the sea. So it's funny, the things that I found so off-putting, you know, the whaling chapters, I mean, I'm sure all of us reading it as young people were like, why do we care? But the thing I found as I began doing more research on maritime life and literature is that the more I knew, the more fascinated I became. And in fact, one phase of Manhattan Beach was really having to pull back on the rather exhaustive amount of research I was packing in there. So I think experimentation always works if it feels necessary to the story that it's telling. For me, his really does. But one irony is that I began Manhattan Beach thinking that it would be much more experimental, sort of more along the lines of Goon Squad, and I had a kind of winking, ironic narrator who would remind readers that the book is set during World War II. Would remind readers that, in fact, it was the 21st century, and I think part of that was that I felt I had been praised for being experimental, so that was kind of my thing. And what I found was, thank God I have a writing group that I can sort of vet some of these ideas with. When I would read parts of the book and the narrator would do that, they really hated it. And they finally performed what I can only call an intervention and basically said, just stop. Like, just don't do it. So what I found is that a book that included things like gangland murder, shipwreck, and ultimately survival at sea, experimentation as I know it, sort of fragmentation, a kind of awareness of contemporary technology, none of that helped me do those things. For me, a much more kind of old-fashioned, robust storytelling felt necessary. So I guess it's just a matter of what lets you tell the story. And if you've got to experiment, do it. And he did it. And in his time, he was really not rewarded for it, which I find really sad.
Yeah. I am now picturing Herman Melville in a writing group bringing Moby-Dick.
Well, we might not have Moby-Dick if he'd had a writing group, so maybe it's good that he didn't.
So can you talk a little bit about Manhattan Beach and Melville's relation to it? The book opens with an epigraph that's from the beginning of Moby-Dick, and obviously nautical in ways, but if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, the epigraph is, yes, as everyone knows, meditation and water are wedded forever. And that line in Moby-Dick comes at the end of a kind of a fascinating, beautiful passage set in New York where the narrator talks about how no matter where you are, people always want to get to the water. They want to get as close as they can and be near it. And the funny thing is, so that is basically what happened to me in the writing of Manhattan Beach. I wanted to write about New York during the war. I immediately became interested in the waterfront and shipbuilding and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. That led me to deep sea diving. So I was deeply into, learning about the Mark V, these huge diving suits that were worn then. And what I found happening, I had no intention of going to sea in the novel. That seemed way too far, too challenging. I'm not a sailor. I know nothing about boats. But I couldn't help it. I felt like, just as Melville said, I kept getting further and further out. And finally I realized, okay, I'm going to sea. And I went to the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point and had a fascinating time in their museum and learned about the Merchant Marine, which turned out to be so fascinating because a lot of people joined the Merchant Marine as an alternative to the Army, thinking it would be safer. In fact, it lost more men proportionately than any of the other divisions because of the German U-boats. And so I became really fascinated by merchant sailing, by the kind of diversity aboard these ships. Before the war too, it was often a very marginal population. There were sometimes people with addictions. It was a place where homosexuals were often much more likely to be accepted because when you're on a boat, you're surrounded by an existential threat, and anyone who can help to sustain life is essential, and all of this other stuff that would have been, really exclusionary on land and prevented a mainstream life was okay. So all of that became really fascinating to me, and I did write about a shipwreck, but the whale figure is the German U-boat. Melville is a sort of origin, Moby-Dick is a kind of origin text, I think, for all of the sea literature that followed it. And it captures so many things that are so riveting. The enormity of the sea, the way the sea is a metaphor but also a real thing, the way it suggests infinity like the stars, but we can touch it. And of course, until after World War II, if you wanted to cross the ocean, that was how you did it. So there was so much involvement with the sea, and yet it has this kind of mythological, timeless, infinite quality. So it's pretty irresistible for a writer, I have to say.
It's funny, as you were talking too, the one thing that occurred to me just now is I love the way you write in Manhattan Beach about putting the diving suit on, which sounds miserable, but it's a very sort of technical writing, but it's really engaging. So I hesitate to use the word technical, but you really get a sense of how it works. And that really reminds me of how Melville writes about chopping up whales,
I think so much of what happens at sea, and you obviously must have contended with this as well in the libretto, which I'm just going to say I read on the elliptical machine today and wept. So that's how powerful this libretto is. It is so wonderful. You're contending with all kinds of technology in anything that has to do with the sea, because staying alive at sea, and especially in the age of sail, you just look at that rigging, how anyone could figure it out. So I think that's where the obsessiveness of the whaling comes in. These are all processes that happen in a certain way, and the more I learned about my processes, which had to do with deep sea diving, and then sailing a Liberty ship, because that's what my sailors are on, the more fascinating these details became. And some would say I included even more than I should have in the final version, but I couldn't resist.
I thought it was the perfect amount. I want to ask both of you, Jake and Gene, also about this sort of the experimentalism in Melville's novel, because I have to imagine that at times it was incredibly helpful, like in the scenes that we heard, where he's almost like making drama for you, and then other times it must have thrown up serious roadblocks. So I wonder if you can talk about just sort of the protean nature of that novel and how you managed to grasp that in terms of adapting it into this opera.
Well, we really were trying to keep our eye on the prize of telling an adventure story, and sort of with overtones. And so a lot of the aspects that you're describing, they really are emerge out of the music. So as I said before, the narrator in an opera is the composer, and the grandeur of what it was like to be on top of the ocean with all this stuff going on underneath you, with the baby whales approaching the ship, all of that which we don't address directly in the opera. I like to think is found, and I do believe is found in Jake's music, in the sort of the overtones of what he's crafted. So through the scope of what Melville was doing, both the experimentation in terms of going off in different directions. I said the other day that one of the things about this book is like when you drop a stone in a pond, and the ripples go out sort of equally. But with this book, it's like an asymmetric design. It's going out in all these different ways and sort of different frequencies, if you will. And this is an opera. This is about, first and foremost, this is about music being able to touch the heart and to make you feel what Melville was describing and what these folks are experiencing on the ship. And so as a librettist, my job, I really believe, is to tee it up, as I've said before, so that music can win the day. I mean, that's what this is about. I mean, why have people sing? I mean, why have people, why are they just not speaking the lines of the book? It's because music can do what, alas, no other art form really can do. It's just, we're all trying to express what music can do, with that feeling of the goosebumps you feel, or the grandeur of music. So I think that the scope of the novel is distilled down into the overtones of the score, and that's kind of how I view my task as a librettist.
And are you able to talk about how that distilled into the score?
He did the most amazing job. It is not easy to write a libretto, period, because if you read a libretto in a room with people and it makes sense on its own, it's not a good libretto. It needs to demand music to tell the story. Otherwise, it's a script, and that's not an opera. And so it needs to demand the stage action. And we worked with a brilliant director, Leonard Folia, and an amazing design team. This production is so epic, it is going to blow your mind. You will not believe what you're seeing happening on that stage.
We have a shot of it. If you guys can pull it up, we can see one picture
It's so
of it.
extraordinary. The set is like a half pipe, like a skateboard ramp. And this action takes place all around here, and then there's this door that comes down, and it's just mind-blowing. That's the scene where Ahab he's insisted on being pulled up to do the lookout.
Which is from the book when he says, I'll man the masthead.
And there's a storm going on, and it's dangerous, and it's so extraordinary, But Gene did this magnificent job of laying up possibility for music to tell something that would fall flat otherwise, or for a big musical interlude, or for a big stage action, and it's just, he's a master. I wanted to say something that was very moving that emerged during that Ahab aria that you heard. I'm going to go over to the piano for a second. We were talking about the depth of the sea and the sky above, and also the depth of the person's heart next to you, which is also part of the book. These unfathomable heights and depths, which was why it was so brilliant of Terrence to think of setting the whole thing at sea. And the theme, the 4-chord theme that emerged, that pervades the entire score, is just this. Back to home. So this thing of like up and back and up and back. And what I didn't realize until I got to the very end, you'll hear it everywhere in the score. And all the major themes and motifs come from that chord progression. But this always makes me cry, because at the end of the score, I was finally at the place where he's going to have to say, "Call me Ishmael." And I was wondering what it was going to be. And all of a sudden, these chords appeared. And I realized it was there all the time. Call me Ishmael. So in other words, when the overture starts and that chord emerges, the opera actually does start with "Call me Ishmael." It's just that he hasn't found it yet.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Jenny, you said a word, obsession, that I want to ask you all about. Obviously, Moby-Dick's a book about obsession, but it's also, the story of the book is also the story of Melville's obsession with writing the book. For those of you who don't know, he it ruined his career, and during the time that he wrote it, it made him go a little nuts. It kind of ruined his eyesight. Anyway, obsession is just everywhere in this book, and it made me think about you are all creative people, and it seems to me that you can't do something creative without a little bit of obsession, but of course you also don't want it to drown you in the ocean. So how do you all manage that tension of living in that obsession, but not letting it go too far?
Well, for me, the obsession is really necessary. That sense that some part of me is always there. I mean, I struggled so much with Manhattan Beach. Part of it was just the amount of research and knowledge that I needed to acquire felt unattainable for a while. And while I didn't have all of that, I felt very unfluent in the world that I was dealing with. And so I felt like it was just failing kind of right in front of me all the time. And so I finally decided, okay, I'm going to give myself permission to put this away. And so I thought, okay, I'm stopping. I'm not writing this book. What am I thinking about? But all I was thinking about was this sort of noirish waterfront, this kind of crime-ridden waterfront, and then this stuff at sea. And, again, and the research felt so alive to me that, I'm going to sound like I do nothing but go on an elliptical machine, but on the elliptical machine, I was reading a handbook to guide a third mate on a merchant ship from like the early 40s, and the print was so tiny, and I was just reading it in fascination. And I remember the guy on the machine next to me was like looking over like, you gotta be kidding, like that's your workout read? And the reason it felt so alive to me. And so that sense of the research itself, all of these lost facts, of this vanished history, and this history that's vanishing from living memory, that being World War II, that obsession was what kept the project alive. So I needed that.
So you lean into it, is what you're saying.
I really do. Yeah. I mean, it hasn't caught up with me yet. We'll see, but it's an essential part of it for me.
Well, I accept it as part of who I am. That this is that Jake and I are working on a project right now. Doesn't matter what to go into it, but I am struggling to try to get my footing with it, and it's just always there. Just always trying to think how can I figure it, and it's just. But I've come to. I'm not fighting it. I'm with you. I'm accepting it that this is just part of. It's been part of who I am since I was a kid, and so it's how it is. I will say this in terms of the relationship between, you touched on it before in terms of the obsession with Melville, of the relationship between Hawthorne and Melville, which was so pivotal, and of course the book is dedicated to him. And as I understand it, the letters from Melville to Hawthorne are one of them are available and the other ones are not.
I think the Hawthorne letters are gone and the Melville letters exist.
I was saying, would you write? I want a great novelist to write that story because someone who could write in Hawthorne's voice, because that would be a great, I think, a point of departure for a book.
I think the obsession is part of it. Or why would you do it otherwise? If I can't, it takes 3, 4, 5 years to write an opera. And if you're not obsessed and on fire with it, why would you do it? Seriously. And that's why I have to feel the music first, that shiver and that excitement and it was terrifying, to think of taking it on. That's not a bad thing, to be scared and also feel inspired and creative. Like, I think I can do this, but I don't know how the hell I'm going to do this every single day. And then to get into that creative zone, that magical creative zone, where suddenly hours and hours go by and you have no idea how much time has gone by. That is the biggest high as a creative artist, where it's just happening. And then when it starts to fade, you're like, no, I have more to do. And you just keep hoping to show up and that it will be there. But the only way it's going to happen is if you feel that fire and you show up for it every day.
One of the things about what we do is that it's truly a collaborative art form. I obviously have to sit and look at a blank piece of paper, but we're talking always about this. We're in it together. This is definitely like 2 musketeers and 3 musketeers and 4 musketeers as the director, and the others and the designers come on board, which is one of the glories of what we do. It's so much fun, to have these folks that are that inspire me, and I feel so lucky to be working with, and and then we become obsessed together, and that's a different vibe, and it's a wonderful thing too.
Well, I have to tell you, speaking of the collaborative nature and all of the incredible people working on the show, I got to go watch a bit of rehearsal last week, which was really fun, and everything you said about the stage is even so much more true in person. I can't wait to see the full thing. But what really struck me sitting there was, here I am in this utterly magnificent opera hall, all of these incredible people, musicians, the conductor, the singers, the crew, all people at the top of their game, working together on this beautiful production about a book, or for a book, that ruined a man. Yeah. And I mean, I think so much about how Moby-Dick both ruined his career and cemented his legacy. And it was it really blew my mind to imagine Herman Melville sitting in that room and, and thinking, I don't know, do you all think about this idea that you can't control your work in the future? You have no idea what's going to happen to it?
You have no control over anything.
Or even the present to some degree.
Yeah.
I mean, because, one does one's best, and then the rest is luck to some degree. And obviously, in your case, it's a collaborative project, so there are more hands on deck, as it were. It's amazing when you are writing about the sea in any way, you realize how much the language of the sea totally permeates our language. We still speak as if we were all on a board ship all the time. I loved learning that. But yeah, I hope for the best.
No, all you can do is put it out there, and the rest of it is way out of your control. And the fact that it did turn, and Melville is now recognized, and that book inspires so many people in so many different kinds of ways, so many different artists, is extraordinary. Excuse me.
Yeah. No, it really is.
So we're going to tee up the next performance in a second. I do want to remind everyone, if you haven't submitted your question yet, probably your last chance, so get those in. Also, we have copies of Manhattan Beach and Moby-Dick for sale, and Jenny will be glad to sign copies of Manhattan Beach, and all 3 of them will sign Moby-Dick. Right? Oh, I already have some questions, so we got a lot. So can we, Gene and Jake, set up the next performance? We're going to come to audience questions after that, but let's hear about what we get next.
Sure. These 2 excerpts, the first one you'll hear is the end of Act 1, and it's the scene which was kind of late in the book, but we used it as the culmination of Act 1, the final scene of Act 1.
It's known as the musket scene.
The musket scene. And in this earlier in Act 1, Starbuck has gone to Ahab's cabin to tell him that some barrels are leaking, and they have to go to find a port for repairs. Take time to tinker with a parcel of hoops, says Ahab. He says, no way. And they have this confrontation, which culminates in Ahab pulling out a gun, a musket, and pointing it at him and threatening to shoot Starbuck. Ultimately, he tells Starbuck to go back up on deck. Now, late in the act, he goes back down, Starbuck goes back down, and this time Ahab is sleeping. And he sees the musket. There's the very musket he pointed at me, loaded with powder in the pan. And he has this, I always say what we're trying to do is create moments in the theater where people are making decisions which will change the trajectory of their lives. And it's the most famous one, of course, is To Be or Not to Be. And in this case, Starbuck, Ahab is laying down, he's asleep, he has a loaded musket, and he can pull the trigger. One touch, and Starbuck may survive to see his wife and child again. What shall I do, basically, to do this or not to do it? And that's the scene the first scene that we're going to do for you. And the second scene is very late in the show. It's from the chapter called the Symphony. It's an incredibly beautiful chapter in the book, in which Starbuck, who has been wrestling with Ahab throughout the telling of the story, finally believes that he's gotten through to Ahab and has awakened the humanity in him. Old Captain, kind of hard after all. I forgot what we wrote, but he sings these. Ahab sings this memory of being of his child, and Starbuck thinks, oh my God. We can alter the course. Let's go back to Nantucket. We can give up this crazy quest. And what is it? What is it that makes I'm unable to give up this quest?
It starts as a solo from Ahab. It moves into duet, a beautiful duet that Starbuck and Ahab sing together about their wives and children back home and the possibility of going back. And then it all goes to hell, and they're gonna do this big scene, and the end of it, Ahab is talking about, who lifts this hand? Is it I, God, or who? And he said, there, and the last line you'll hear is there, and this is when Gene brilliantly had Ahab cite Moby-Dick. It's amazing. It's just anyway. So those are the two excerpts. We shouldn't talk about it anymore. Yeah. Okay.
All right, let's hear it.
So here is Thomas Glass to sing Starbuck, the musket scene.
Captain Ahab, I must speak with you, sir. He is sleeping. He would have shot me. There's the very musket he pointed at me, loaded. And powder in the pan. He would have killed me with the very thing in my hands. Would he fain kill all his crew? My soul swears this ship will come to deadly harm. What cares Ahab? Is there no other way, no lawful way? Make him a prisoner to be taken. Wrest the old man's living power from his own hands. Only a fool would try it. The men have vowed thy vows. Now all of us are Ahabs. Lord, is it murder to strike a would-be murderer in his bed? Oh Lord, what shall touch and Starbuck may survive to see his wife and child again return to them alive. Oh, Mary, oh, my boy, great God, where art thou now? Starbuck, it is a mild, mild wind, and a mild-looking sky. On such a day, very much such a sweetness as this, I speared my first whale, a boy, a harpooner of 18, 40 years, 40 years ago. On the pitiless sea, 40 years making war on the horrors of the deep. 40 years I have not spent 3 ashore, whole oceans away from that young wife I wedded past 50. Wife, rather a widow with her husband alive. Why this weary strife of the chase? How the richer or better now is Ahab. What a 40 years fool old Ahab has been. Close, stand close to me, Starbuck. Let me look into a human eye. It is better than to gaze into sea or sky. Better than to gaze upon God. That hazard shall not be thine. Not with that far away home I see in thine Captain, grand old heart after all, why should anyone give chase to that hated fish? Let's get on to the course, sir. How cheerily, how hilariously would we bowl on our way to see old Nantucket. Some such mild blue days, even as this, in old Nantucket. They have. I have seen them. Some summer days in the morning. Some summer days wild and blue. About this time, it is his noon nap time. And my boy vivaciously awakes. Sits up in bed, and his mother tells him of me, of valuable old me, how I am abroad upon the deep, but will yet come back to dancing again. He is carried up the hill to catch the first glance of his father's sail. His father's sail. Oh, see, oh, see. The boy's face at the window, the boy's hand on the hill. There on some summer day in the morning, some summer It is done. We head for Nantucket. What is it, Captain? What is it? Study the course and let us away. What is it? What nameless, unearthly thing is it? Away, Captain! What hidden lord and master commands me, that against all natural law voice and longing. Captain, our boys, I so keep pushing and crowding, our boys, and jamming myself on all the time. There, on the hill, what remorseless emperor commands me? Is Ahab, Captain, there on the hill? Is it I, God or who, that lifts this
It's very amazing. Thank you very much. We are going to take a couple of questions from the audience. We're running a little late, and there are so many, so we'll try and do a few of them. But very quickly, I would like to thank our friends at the Met Opera, who we couldn't do these events without. I think we've been doing this for 3 or 4 years now, and I'd really like to thank Melanie Milton, Colin Miyamoto, Matt Dobkin, and Marcia Drummond. You're all amazing to work with, and again, that we get to give you some free opera is just such a privilege for us, so thank you. I'm going to pick out a couple themes in these questions that we had talked about already, and a couple people asked a similar question, which is, what do you hope that Melville would say about this opera? I mean, awesome, right?
I actually hope I would know exactly how he felt by looking in his eye. And if he would give me a hug, I would know.
Do you think he was a hugger?
No, which is why the hug would mean even more.
Gene, do you have any hopes?
Well, I just, I would like to, I would imagine he would, I would like to imagine that he would, that the music that Jake has written is the music that was kind of in his heart when he was writing the book. So that's what I would hope.
This one jumps out a little bit that we didn't get to talk about, but is interesting. How did the religious themes and positioning of the whale as God find their way into the opera, if they did?
They're definitely there.
It's all. Look, it's a huge book, and the fact that things are not hit over the head with, where I underscore certain things, no pun intended, that doesn't mean that it's not there. And you feel, Starbuck's relationship with God and Christianity is part of this opera, and the first line that actually that Ahab sings that I wrote was "Infinity, we will harvest infinity," and that's when he makes his entrance. And he's going straight up against the deity, and right from the get-go of this thing. So it's all there, but without trying to hit it over the head too much.
In that scene where there's a confrontation between Ahab and Starbuck, where he pulls out the rifle, the musket, and is going to shoot him, he says to Starbuck, "There is but one God over heaven and only one captain over the Pequod." So he puts himself on this very high plane.
Sounds a little Trumpy.
Yeah, well, please, let's not go there right now. But
I know,
but the themes are
let's talk
universal,
art.
aren't they? It happens over and over again. Melville knew.
That's the
Yeah.
Listen. this one of the reasons why this book is so great, as we've said,
The production feels
so great is because,
present and current.
but getting back to the book, it's because it's timeless and timely, and it certainly, when we wrote this, the Iraq War was going on, and so this book always seems timely.
I would just add one thing, which is that in my research of survival at sea, because so many mariners were ended up in lifeboats or rafts, and it really all, and so people in very similar situations, sometimes things would go horribly, and sometimes people would sail, 1,700 miles in a lifeboat to shore, and it all came down to leadership. Leadership and order on board was everything. I mean, that was the key to survival. So the person in that job, and we can think of that in any way we want, has a lot of impact on all of the other people in the vessel.
Now, someone wanted to know, Jenny, listening to the music tonight and the conversation, whether you are inclined to try your hand at writing a libretto.
Oh my God, I don't think I would dare. I have often thought of trying other genres, but I really feel like my efforts are best spent trying to get better at what I do. But I will say, in terms of thinking about what Melville would think, I think there's really no greater honor and thrill than thinking that other artists have been inspired enough by something one has done to make other great art from it. So I think he would be really thrilled. And I think I'm going to leave the librettos to the experts.
Okay, and we're going to end on this. There were a couple questions came in that were basically like, convince me why I should read Moby-Dick. I think we did a pretty good job so far, but
I want to tell you the greatest compliment at the end of the opera when I talk to people, and it happens a lot. They see the opera and they say, well, now I need to read the book. And it's exactly what we hoped people would say. Yeah.
I can answer that in one sentence. In 2 words, it's fun. It's fun. The book is funny, it's wild, it's extreme. There are amazing characters. It's packed with action. I mean, if you like to read, I think it would satisfy virtually any and every impulse that draws you to fiction. It's spectacular.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what you said about wanting to read it after the opera, even just having gotten taste of it, I'm feeling the hunger to read it again. So thank you very much for that. Thank you again to everyone for being here. Please don't forget there's copies of Moby-Dick in Manhattan Beach available for sale. And you can get tickets for the opera Moby-Dick at metopera.org. So thank you again for coming and have a great night, everybody.